This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
We're delighted that at the end of this Decolonization workshop we're able to launch this book, Andrew Thompson's edited volume in the Oxford History of the British Empire Companion Series, Britain's Experience of Empire in the 20th Century. It was published, I think, at the very end of last year. And we have three contributors speaking this evening. Philip Murphy, who of course needs no introduction as Director of the Institute, and the volume's editor, Professor Andrew Thompson of the University of Leeds. Andrew, of course, is author and editor of numerous important works, including most recently his book Empire and Globalization. And we also have Richard Whiting, who is Professor of Modern British History at the University of Leeds and has published extensively on the Labour Party and British politics in the 20th century, and is currently writing about trade unionism and British politics there. So I think the format of this is going to be that I'm going to say something about the book, and then the various contributors. Right. So then we will go Andy, Richard, and then Philip, as Philip suggests. Okay. Well, thanks very much for Andy for asking me to comment on the book. I'm really pleased to do so. It seems that at the moment the British are currently being pushed from all directions to think about their experiences of empire. Paxman, in his BBC series Empire, repeatedly prompts his interviewees, or at least he did in the episode that I saw, to think about and make value judgments about British imperialism. And the title of his accompanying book is instructive: what ruling the world did to the British. Richard Gott's recent catalogue of atrocities and violence committed in the name of British imperialism demands also that we think about empire's brutalising effects. Kwasi Kwarteng's new book offers another perspective altogether. And then we have the Falklands back in the news at the moment. So this volume couldn't be more timely. We need measured approaches that look at the experience in the round. And as Andy says in the excellent introduction to the book, it's the first, quote, systematic investigation of the impact of imperialism upon 20th century Britain. Now, in some ways, I think this distracts from ways in which this volume is genuinely innovative across a broader spectrum of imperial history than just the 20th century. We have notable books and edited collections, particularly on metropolitan culture and imperialism, but there are very few that unite within one volume, as this one does: economy, culture, politics and religion. In some ways, I think the closest that we have to this is Andrew's own book, The Empire Strikes Back, and perhaps the chapters in the original Oxford History volumes, the original volumes in the Oxford History of the British Empire series. So I think OUP might take note and perhaps consider comparable collections for earlier periods. But at another level, I think Andrew's clearly right to reflect on the relative neglect of the 20th century and the experience of empire in Britain. Now, as he contends, this is in no small part because historians interested in the domestic impact of empire have tended to focus on the 18th and the 19th centuries at the relative cost of studying the 20th century, especially the period after 1914. I take minor issue with him here in that I think the period after the Second World War is perhaps better served than his comments in the introduction suggest. Whereas in some ways I think it's the historiography of the early part of the century that's been most neglected in recent years. Now I say that in the full knowledge that we have here two historians whose works have contributed so much to our understanding of the early part of the century: Andrew himself, Barbara Bush's early work, and so on. But it seems to me that this is a period that has been particularly neglected in very recent years. Although it may be that the literature on cultures of empire is stronger for this earlier period, than it is for the post-Second World War era. But whatever, we have a picture, I think, that's one of peaks and troughs, with the result that it's been difficult before now to explore the domestic experience of empire across the entire century. And if historians of empire have been slow to address questions of domestic experience of imperialism in relation to the 20th century, so I think we can say have historians of domestic Britain, i.e. those who begin from a British history perspective. At risk of sweeping generalisation, with some notable exceptions, like Wendy Webster, one of the other contributors to this volume who couldn't be here today, historians of the 20th century, I think, have been among the last to heed calls to integrate the history of Britain with the history of Britain overseas. Perhaps because of a tendency to hive off diplomacy and foreign affairs and write about it as a discrete area of British history. And it seems to me that the historiography of modern Britain, focused as it is on the expansion and contraction of the state, economic decline, social change, perhaps remains more inward-looking than that for the 18th and the 19th centuries. And just by way of illustration of this, in preparation for this panel, I had a quick look at the two books on British history that were closest to hand for me at home. One was a recently revised edition in 2007 of what's billed on the cover as the market-leading textbook in the field of 20th century history. It has a range of outstanding contributors, but of 23 chapters in the book, not one is devoted to empire. This is a book on the 20th century. And quick perusal of the index reveals that of 370 pages, only some 13 have anything to say about empire, and Commonwealth only gets a mention in relation to Europe. Similar picture with the second book I picked up, which was David Edgerton's important study of the warfare state. Here is a book that's trying to completely rewrite our understanding of the British state, the warfare state rather than the welfare state. But it remains sufficiently constrained within the frame of the nation that, rather than the imperial state, that there's not a single index entry to empire or Commonwealth, or indeed to some of Britain's key Commonwealth countries. Now, part of the reason for this neglect might lie with the broader issue that's addressed with great clarity, I think, in Philip's contribution to the volume, which is Britain's role as a global power. And that's the difficulties of isolating the imperial from Britain's wider overseas role. So, as all of this indicates, this book is greatly to be welcomed. And part of its very considerable strength lies in part in its broad thematic and chronological approach. In contrast to the cultural bias of much of the new imperial history, it gives equal and proper weight to economics and politics as well as culture. And I think we're in classic Thompson territory here. And there are also features which characterise Andrew's own chapter in the volume, which is about empire in the public imagination, but which draws on a wider range of sources than I think might often be the case to explore his subject. The selection of chapters makes a huge amount of sense. One of the standout chapters for me was that on religion. Religion doesn't always feature strongly, especially in relation to the history of imperialism in Britain. In fact, beyond sort of Susan Thorne's book, it's quite hard to think of many studies that do really address religion and empire in the domestic context. But with the chronology of secularisation in Britain being rethought, with Callum Brown locating the death of Christian Britain in the 1960s, it's all the more appropriate that this book gives real space to the theme of religion. And the chapter on religion is by Jeff Cox. It's characteristically lively and stimulating, and for me it's one of the real highlights of the volume. I also really appreciated having a chapter by Philip in this book, because I think including a chapter on Britain's global role, in many ways it's a very obvious thing to do, but at another level, too often it's something that's absent from books on imperialism in the domestic context, and yet without it it's very difficult to ground understanding of imperial phenomena in British society in relation to the way in which empire mediated Britain's place in the world. So overall, the theme selected seemed to make eminent sense, but inevitably, it must have, in selecting it, must have involved hard choices for Andrew as editor, and there are always things that one might wish to see figure which don't. I'm going to throw out a couple of suggestions just by way of generating discussion rather than complaint, but as I'm aware that it's very easy to come up with a shopping list approach to volumes like this. The first area that it seems to me that would repay further study is that of the British state. Of course, we have numerous accounts of imperial policy making. Indeed, the emphasis on policy making has been an arguable weakness to some of the 20th century historiography, giving it an overly traditional feel. But to return to the question of the historiographical project of integrating the history of domestic with overseas Britain, it seems to me that we need to engage still more with the degree to which empire really was or was not important in relation to some of the areas that have most preoccupied historians of 20th century Britain. And to a large degree, that means the state. Now, Andy highlights some potentially worthwhile areas. For instance, the transfer of ideas between metropole and empire about the role of the state in welfare and economy. And actually, this is an issue that we heard a little bit about this morning in Charlotte Riley's paper. But what about the place of the apparatus for administering empire in the organisation of the state? We've got valuable studies, of course, of the imperial administrative services, although no modern scholarly history of the Colonial Office. But these are ghettoised as the preserve of the historian of empire and decolonisation. How much did the management and organisation of empire shape institutions of the British state? It's a theme which I think Philip does most to address in his chapter, in his discussion of defence and the RAF and so on. But I think it's one which would repay more examination. That brings me to a second area. It's rather a self-promoting one in view of my own research on institutions, but perhaps there is more to be said about how a range of institutions, schools, universities, professional bodies, were or were not shaped by empire. This volume does a great job of addressing questions of empire in, on the one hand, British high politics, economic thinking, overseas strategy, and on the other, in popular culture and society, but there might profitably be more focus on institutions which occupied a space between the individual and the nation or state, and in many cases not only provided the frames in which individual imperial vocations were lived out, but also behind the scenes shaped the career paths of others who might not otherwise have conceived of their lives as necessarily having an imperial dimension. Institutions in the form of domestic churches are central to Geoffrey Cox's discussion, but they might have found a place perhaps in, say, Wendy Webster's chapter in terms of the exploring the reception given to Commonwealth immigrants in Britain. It's a theme which we might notice is going to figure prominently in Ian Jones's forthcoming study of generational experience of post-war religion in Birmingham. A third question, which is specifically to Andy about the organisation, is prompted by thinking about this book alongside his earlier book, The Empire Strikes Back. There, the early chapters were organised around categories of class, generation and gender, with one consequence being that the book provided very ample illustration of the plurality of British responses to empire. They are present in this book, but I think they figure a little less prominently than they did in your earlier book, and I wonder whether that's a conscious historiographical manoeuvre, or whether it reflects a sort of changing assessment on your part. Now, these selected themes, they're discussed in relation to the century as a whole, with some variations in emphasis naturally across different chapters. Richard and Philip's chapters, for me, stand out here. I really appreciated the way in which, respectively, they grapple with their subjects across the century, and in doing so, at least in relation to the later decades, move beyond the established literature to address questions of empire and Commonwealth in Richard's case in politics in the later decades. I think it takes us beyond an established literature in new ways there. And the book as a whole offers a fascinating exploration of the afterlife of empire in Britain. Now, this broad chronological approach provides a platform for assessing the differential impact of imperialism over the century, as well as exploring its particular geographical foci. In his introduction, Andy points to the more insular nature of British culture and political life in the interwar years, as well as the marginality of Britain's role in the Middle East in popular conceptions of empire, but concludes that the greater insularity of the interwar years didn't mean that imperial consciousness had diminished. However, he observes that the further one moves, I'm quoting from him here, into the 20th century, the more the concept of empire begins to shrivel. It seems a claim that is destined to make its way to exam papers in the future, which the directive discussed. And to me, the idea of shrivel seems to encapsulate the changing purchase of empire remarkably well. Overall, the book offers a careful and nuanced assessment of the place of empire in Britain's experience in the 20th century. And in the last chapter, Andy concludes that empire exercised a pervasive influence, again I quote from him there, upon British life. I think there are good reasons for opting for this concept of pervasive influence, because it doesn't commit to any claims about the priority of, or otherwise, of aspects of empire in British life, while at the same time it makes a clear statement of their significance. But one might contend that as a result, the book perhaps falls short of fully addressing the question posed some time ago by my emeritus colleague, Peter Marshall. That is, was empire transformative of British life, or, as Peter put it, of no fatal impact? And I think, for me, this point is illustrated by reference to Jim Tomlinson's chapter, which is on the economy. It offers a fascinating account of empire in the 20th century, in 20th century economic thought. But what it doesn't really do is attempt to offer a full analysis of the economic impacts of empire in Britain. Now, it's hardly surprising, it's almost impossible to do this because the evidence really isn't there. As it is, in terms of the existing literature, we really leap from studies that end around 1914 and then leapfrog over to the post-Second World War period in Charles Feinstein's analysis of economics and empire. We don't really have, at the 20th century, the kind of synoptic accounts that St. Patrick O'Brien has produced for earlier centuries. And I know that trying to estimate costs and balances can lead us into quite sterile quantitative discussions. But it does seem to me that some overarching assessment is called for if we're to address questions about the overall role of empire in 20th century Britain. And I think it's also possible to raise such questions where no quantification is conceivable. For example, to look beyond the economy, it might be worth thinking about whether it makes sense in any meaningful way to describe 20th century Britain as an imperial nation. I might say I wrote this and then I remembered, of course, that Andy has authored a book called Imperial Britain, because I wanted to ask each of you whether you feel that actually calling Britain as imperial, an imperial state or imperial nation, is an appropriate way to describe Britain in the 20th century, because that's one way, I think, of illuminating these questions of transformative effect or not. And another aspect of this might be to think about how far empire figures as a causal factor in 20th century Britain's understanding of how their country came to be what it was at the end of the 20th century and what it is now. But having said all this, it seems to me that possibly this book makes a bolder statement about Britain's imperial experience than The Empire Strikes Back did. There, Andrew concluded that, quote, the big theory behind the book is that there is no big theory. And as already mentioned, it emphasised pluralities of response and cultures of empire. Now, as an edited collection, this book, of course, contains contributions from historians who have different perspectives on this, and some of them, I think, have adopted stronger positions perhaps than Andy himself has. Plurality and differential impacts are certainly dominant themes in this book too, including through emphasis on regional variations, a theme in Krishnan and Kumar's stimulating chapter, and over time in the course of the 20th century. And contributors also play up the countervailing influences in British culture, such as the Anglo-American relationship, or ones in which empire was but one part, for example, broader globalising phenomena. But I wonder, even so, whether you'd see this book as advancing a bolder claim or not. And if so, whether this is the natural consequence of a developing historiography, i.e. the rather sort of basic thing that the more studies we have that begin from the point of investigating empire's impacts in British life, the more evidence we are going to turn up of the nature of that impact. I've spoken for too long, so I will stop there. But to conclude, I think this is a wonderful addition to the literature. All the chapters in it are engaging, authoritative, stimulating, and it's going to be an absolutely fantastic resource for teaching. So, Andy.
Well, I should thank Sarah for a very generous response, and also I think a shrewd and stimulating set of comments. I'm conscious at this hour of the day that all that stands between you and a glass of wine is 4 people on the panel up here, so I won't try and pick up every point that you mentioned, but perhaps if Sarah I could pick up a couple, and then maybe just take a couple of things that I wanted to say as well. The architecture of the book is an interesting point to raise, and of course it's probably one of the most fundamental things that we all face as historians and authors when we start a project, because once you lock yourself into any architecture or structure, then it partly determines what then sort of follows. I think my starting point was the great privilege of an editor of any volume is that you get to pick who participates. So I wanted people from quite diverse sort of backgrounds, and I think you've already begun to convey that for people here. Krishan Kumar is really a historical sociologist, I suppose, interested in national identity and comparative empires. Jeff Cox, a historian of religion and also of missionary activity. Wendy Webster, of immigration and cultural responses to empire. Jim Tomlinson, I think of much a historian of economic thought as an economic historian actually. Richard, who is a colleague of mine, former colleague at Leeds, I've always admired the way that he's able to weave together the histories of institutions and ideas in a political context. And I think you've already said that Philip wrote what I think is this wonderfully eclectic and wide-ranging approach to thinking about Britain's world role. And in many ways that's quite an integrative chapter for the volume. So I think I probably sort of picked people rather than subjects to begin with, and that more than anything, if I'm being honest, determined the way that the volume took shape. The other thing that you raised, and I'd perhaps like to come back to, is this idea of the relationship between empire and the British state. And I think that that's probably hard to do justice to in a brief response, because it's a multi-layered relationship. One obvious way to think about it, and the way you prompted us to think about it, is in terms of how key British institutions have their identities invested in empire. And Richard, you touched at the end of your talk thinking about secondary decolonisation, about how those identities then have to get reinvented almost, or reworked, as you go through that process of not just politically but psychologically and emotionally and temperamentally beginning to sort of distance or emancipate yourself from that empire. And Sarah, you rightly mentioned that there are the institutions that we all perhaps would think about most obviously in terms of the armed forces and parliament and monarchy. But I think that one of the ways in which the scholarship is now developing, and it is interesting to see the number of people who are working on the metropolitan consequences of decolonisation as we speak, and yet their fruits of their research has not yet been published. And I think there's quite a large group of people who are going to publish some of whom are in the room at the moment, and are going to publish very interesting work in this area in the next few years. But I would say if you think about the British state, you can think about institutions, but there's a whole discursive framework that we have today for thinking about the British state, which we inherited for better and for worse from the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Declinism, multiculturalism, modernity, disintegration, one could go on. Some key concepts that we've had for thinking about the British state in post-war history were actually concepts that in some ways were either born of or profoundly shaped by the processes of decolonisation. And I'm not sure we've always registered that fully as British historians. A couple of other remarks, and then I'll pass over to Richard and Philip. It's pretty hard in a few minutes to try and go to a book like this and come up with some summarising comments. And I sort of feel slightly exhausted or depleted on this subject because I've written 3 books about it and had 3 bites at the cherry. But if I think back to when I started as a graduate student 20 years ago in this, the world looks so different, and it is worth reminding ourselves of that, I think, very much. You know, it's now pretty much a commonplace, I think, to hear historians say that the British past can't be fully appreciated within its sort of own self-sufficient, you know, national borders, that the nation is a distorting prism in, you know, a globalising world. I'm not dissenting from any of that, but we hear a lot of that. And the move of the empire from the sidelines to the centre stage of British history is so well advanced now that I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the situation which previously pertained, because it wasn't like that at all. And the era of the 60s and 70s actually witnessed the consolidation of a very different, if not antithetical, interpretation. And it was centred on the sort of ingrained ignorance, if I can put it like that, of the British towards their empire. Empire was something that might have originated in Britain, but it was very much judged to have happened overseas. And that view consolidated itself and only really began to be effectively challenged in the 1980s. And for the 1980s and 1990s, there was a lot of resistance to it. Now, that resistance hasn't entirely petered out, as we know, but it's a moot point which was the stronger, the sort of opposing or resisting sort of forces at that time. And I think this idea that the empire might have a key interpretive role in the study of Britain's sort of metropolitan past probably for many seemed fairly remote, if not far-fetched, until relatively recently. And I think it's worth registering that. But having registered it, to go on to ask why. And I mean, just a couple of thoughts on that. I think that the onset of global decolonisation from the 1940s to the end of the 60s actually nurtured in itself an idea that metropolitan societies were hermetically sort of sealed off from their dissolving empires. So there's something going on there. And I think one source of that idea came from disgruntled elements in Britain's settler colonies and the Dominions. But also the disaggregation of the imperial from the domestic is evident in some of those, as we know, who very much cared about empire, and most obviously, I suppose, Enoch Powell. So, Powell keenly feeling the spiritual amputation, as it was called, of Indian independence in 1947, but completely rearranging his thoughts in the 1960s, and then turning his anger to what he quotes, the persisting illusion that there is a world elsewhere, and likening the imperial past to a debilitating injury that had diverted people's energies and aspirations to self-defeating ends. So the historiographical turn has been strong, but actually a relatively recent. And I think I'm probably going to stop there and hand over to Richard and then Philip.
Thanks very much. Well, if I can just answer the questions that were posed very fruitfully at the beginning. First of all, about the question of was this a transformative experience, and secondly, about the state, if I may, and answer them from respect to my own chapter, which was about British politics. I suppose, in a way, the view of British politics that I would take, which is not very explicit in the chapter, in fact, but would be to say, no, it wouldn't be transformative. Because of what one thinks politicians are doing or are up to, if you like, in 20th century Britain in relation to, particularly to empire. And I think one's conscious when you write about British politics and empire, there is a kind of a danger, of course, in focusing on politicians and their utterances, that in a sense you might, as it were, go back to quite an early or perhaps traditional understanding of Britain and empire and decolonisation that stressed political discretion, if you like, in some form. Whereas now I think imperial historians look at an interlocking set of explanations for withdrawal from empire, partly domestic, partly international, partly what's happening in the colonies, colonial resistance and so on. So what I think, the view of politics I would have is to ask what are politicians really doing. What they're engaged in is obviously at certain key moments policy, but they're also engaged as party politicians in the seeking of rhetorical advantage. Can our language, as it were, implant in the nation that we have the prime view on any given policy topic, the prime conviction, if you like, about that area of what the state is engaged in. And that springs from, I suppose, a sense that, very broadly speaking, I know consensus is kind of an unfashionable way of thinking about it now, but British politicians probably operate across the parties in a fairly narrow range of policy difference. So they're playing out this in trying to strike this sort of rhetorical advantage, if you like, that gives them the advantage in that area. And I suppose if you apply that to British politicians of the period, one might say in a very simple-minded way, well, of course, Labour has, as it were, a rather automatic rhetorical advantage in the sense of being anti-colonial from one of two possible perspectives. One is a sort of libertarian view from within the empire that focuses perhaps on liberation, or the view of a more social democratic kind, that the empire is an unfortunate excrescence, as it were, upon the state and is diverting it for its proper purpose. But either way, Labour probably has an easier task, and Nicholas Owen has said, you know, Labour was on the winning side on the empire question, even though it didn't actually cause the victory. And one can see that, I suppose, moments of difficulty for Labour. It wasn't entirely straightforward. I suppose Wilson over Rhodesia was much more difficult than the claims they could make for Attlee over India. I think if one then takes the Conservative position, and the Conservative position, of course, is the more important because the Conservatives really drive British politics in the 20th century, one can look at two very good recent accounts of Macmillan, for example, recent studies of Macmillan. One is Simon Ball's book, The Guardsman, about Macmillan and his friends from youth into senior politics, which talks about particularly the rivalry and the conflict between Macmillan and Salisbury over Rhodesia, and also Saul Dubos's very recent article on the Wind of Change speech published in the Historical Journal, about that at least part of that is, as it were, addressing a domestic audience. And I suppose that Wind of Change, of course, is noted in that article and referred to by me as well, of course, picks up a comment from Baldwin as well in the 1930s, making a very similar point. Here was the reference to an ineluctable trend that one had to go with. And of course, for both Baldwin and Macmillan, this chimed in with their conservatism, a conservatism that was moderate, that was unaggressive, that accepted modern democracy. And of course, for people like, for Macmillan's position, many social reforms going on about individual affluence, individual freedom in the 1950s and 60s, for which the imperial story was a rather unhappy contrast. So I think that that really tries to answer, in a sense, about the transformative effect on British politics, in the sense that what are politicians engaged in? They're at least in part engaged in the struggle for individual and party advantage within obviously certain policy frameworks, but that is their prime aim, and they're trying to achieve that advantage. And of course, for very often, what's happening is as serious within their parties as between them. So I'll move now to the question of the state, which I didn't spend very much time on, hardly at all, in fact, in my own chapter. But I suppose if one has a very, very crude periodization of the state, particularly if one goes post-1945, one might say that by the 1970s, one has a social democratic state in the sense of one committed to welfare that in a way is rather inward-looking or preoccupied with welfare, economic performance and so forth, and for whom now the empire has been solved and dealt with very largely. And that, I think, certainly is characteristic. You can see some elements of that in Labour's withdrawal from east of Suez, those sort of sentiments apparent there. Of course, that coincided, or was a decade that was an actually atrocious one in terms of British history, probably one of the worst of the century. The salvation from that, if you like, of Margaret Thatcher, of course, has within it, at one level, one of the last colonial conflicts, the Falklands War, but in a crucial sense, I think, the best study of Thatcher by Shirley Robin Letwin said that Thatcher's was essentially a post-imperial conservatism. It was not one in which empire played a significant part, even though she had her own sympathies with the imperial past. But that has been her period has been portrayed as a rather transitional one between the social democratic state that embodies certain national values through a commitment to a stronger market economy, if you like, but one which nonetheless tries to express, and you may express it rather in rather stumbling form, but nonetheless expresses a certain national purpose. But then that, one might very crudely say that begins, particularly under sort of Blair and so on later, to have the recognition of the more important global economy and so forth, in which the role that the state becomes subtly different, is much less deterministic of what happens within Britain than would have been the case before the 1970s, or even in the aspirations of the 1970s. What are the implications for empire, Britain's external relations of the changes of the state? I suppose one could say, again, very crudely, that earlier forms relied upon a commitment to empire, an involvement in empire, often by the individuals concerned, a long-standing commitment to empire. In doing that, a recognition of difference that may be quite subtle and striking, may reflect their educational background in classical education and so forth. In the more modern sphere, in the very recent sphere, of course, it's rather different. There is less sense of commitment to specific other societies, and the sense of difference has been glossed over, I think, in terms of what are seen as more universal attributes or rights that people may support or subscribe to, and which particular countries may try and fulfill and provide. So that's a very quick response to a very interesting question, which wasn't really answered in my chapter. So I'll finish there, if I may.
Thank you. Philip.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Sarah, for your generous remarks. On this, Andrew talked about picking the contributors and summoned up this almost biblical image of going around collecting his crew. I should just say that when we first talked about this at a reception at the Reform Club, launching one of William Roger Louis' many adventures in Britannia, and I came away convinced that I'd agreed to do the chapter on empire and British politics, which I thought I could knock off pretty quickly. And when Andrew told me that I'd actually agreed to do the chapter on Britain as a global power in the 20th century, it rather spoilt my day. And it is a sort of major problem, not only synthesizing this vast literature, but actually trying to say anything meaningful. And to pick out a few, I mean, in order to talk about how I might pick out a few ideas from there, I'd perhaps refer back to one of the stranger engagements I've had whilst being director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which was earlier this year when I was asked to give a lecture at the Shrivenham Defence Academy. And the subject they'd given me was the Commonwealth and threats to security in the 21st century. And which sounded like a completely ridiculous idea to me. And I kind of had to discreetly explain to them that it had no role before pocketing their rather generous fee. But it also kind of rather made me wonder why they'd come up with this title. And clearly it's partly that Cameron and Hague have been talking about the Commonwealth in a slightly more positive way than previous administrations have done recently in terms of Britain's global position. But I also think it's something about the way in which we're beginning to think about empire in a military sense. And I thought about, this famous image if it will come up to that. It will take its time. This image of soldiers from different Commonwealth countries marching together. Is it going to do it? Yeah. And I mean, I keep on seeing this. It's been used on the front cover of Wendy Webster's book, Andrew Stewart's book. You see it used in lots of historical magazines. And I think I slightly wonder whether in the process of writing the empire back into the history of the two world wars, quite rightly, and recording and memorialising the experiences of troops from the colonies, we're almost in danger of creating a kind of, or recreating the myth of empire as a great military resource. And I think one of the things that I was trying to do in that essay was slightly to puncture that on a number of grounds. And the first thing one had to tell these military officers is, okay, Commonwealth it derives from empire, and the essential force shaping Empire Commonwealth in the 20th century is centrifugal. It's the individual territories demanding and eventually being granted their autonomy and clinging to that autonomy and defending that autonomy. And that, of course, militates against any sort of pooling of sovereignty or authority for the purposes of military planning. And it's why you never have anything resembling the kind of Commonwealth NATO, and the British government, as much as the government of the Dominions in the interwar period, rejects any kind of meaningful military cooperation because it will restrict Britain's ability to make key decisions. That empire is inherently so fragile as a political entity in the 20th century that affects the utility of imperial troops. Take India, for example. John Darwin, of course, calls Britain's Indian Empire a bank of military power. Its revenues capable from the second half of the 19th century of supporting an army of 140,000 men and a British garrison about half the size. But of course, British military planners in the early 20th century are very pessimistic about their capacity to withstand a Russian attack on India without massive reinforcements. They're very nervous about using Indian troops for political reasons in circumstances where those troops might sustain very high casualties. In the 30s, they start to subsidise India's military budget. They feel that it's completely politically unacceptable to write off India's sterling balances in the way that they happily negotiate down to about 3% their debts from the United States at the end of the Second World War. All because of the extreme political fragility of empire. And I think the key problem with empire is that it doesn't look like a conventional military power sufficient to deter Britain's enemies. It's during the First World War, Avner Offner talks about this, how the Germans, their horizons are really limited by Europe. So they don't see the full military economic potential of the British Empire, but in a way the British don't either. The same is true in the Second World War. The empire is not a deterrent, partly because the British themselves don't know what the Dominions will do. And W. David McIntyre talks about an official in the Dominions office in late 1937 trying to dream up potential halfway houses for the Dominions between outright neutrality and full military action. And it's not surprising, under those circumstances, it doesn't deter Germany. The British, as Sarah was saying, have a far broader set of global priorities and global strategies for maintaining great power status in the 20th century than empire alone. Indeed, one could say that probably over the course of the 20th century, Britain's relationship with the United States is far more important in that set of strategies than its relationship with empire in maintaining that great power role. And indeed, when the dissolution of empire does remarkably little to affect that fundamental British will to great power status. You can see that in the case of Ceylon. When Ceylon becomes independent in 1948, Britain retained a base there. When the base is closed down in 1958, those defence responsibilities are simply divided amongst existing stations. And Ashley Jackson says, the case of Ceylon, quote, reveals two enduring British defence themes. On the one hand, the desire never to abandon a commitment, even when that commitment was being scaled down. On the other, the habit of stretching resources to continue to meet those commitments. And you can see that right through to today's strategic defence reviews. And finally, the ways in which these kind of habits of mind, these what Corelli Barnett called Britain's moralising internationalism, continue right up until the present day. When one looks at the wordings of some quite recent strategic defence reviews, any historian of empire will have a sort of grim smile on their face. The 1998 Strategic Defence Review, and the first that the Blair government did, talks about the British are by instinct an internationalist people. We believe that as well as defending our rights, we should discharge our responsibilities in the world. We don't want to stand idly by and watch humanitarian disasters or the aggression of dictators go unchecked. We want to give a lead. We want to be a force for good. And on his way out of power, 2007, in Building on Progress, Britain and the World, again, Tony Blair talked about Britain being a force for good. And the document suggests that whereas in recent years Britain's military role had been envisaged in terms of relatively brief engagements, recent experiences had demonstrated that future operations were, quote, likely to involve protracted periods of peace enforcement activity, delivering long-term security solutions through stabilisation, reconstruction, and re-establishment of the rule of law. As I say in the final sentence of that chapter, the future sounds oddly familiar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are due to have a reception that is down on the programme is beginning at 7, but we'll probably start a little early. But Andrew, Richard and Philip have all, on the other hand, agreed to answer a couple of questions, if there are any. So can I ask, does anybody have a question that they would like to put to?
I don't have a question, I have a statement.
Okay.
If I can make one.
Comparatively briefly, if you
yes,
can. Thank
I will try. I do not belong to the academic world, and I do not possess the lucidity of the rhetoric that is used here. But in my simple way, let me say this. I'm a son of the empire, born, brought up in Kenya, parents from India, who went to Kenya because of the empire. 20 years in post-colonial administration of Kenya, inherited the colonial bureaucracy, very proud of it, and 6 years in Commonwealth Secretariat of the 42 years working career. When I was at school, one subject we learnt was British Empire history, right from secondary school, 4 years. And when I came here to do my A-levels, I was horrified that what I thought to be history of Britain did not feature empire at all. It was a great shock to me, and I just wondered, where has the empire gone? Subsequently, at the street level, all along in my long career here and in United Nations, all I have seen is negation of this phenomenon, empire. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's better not talk, better not discuss. I welcome this particular book. I haven't read it, but I will read it. From what I've heard from the 4 presentations, it seems to talk the sort of things I've been looking for. but I do not have one answer. How will all this work that is a pleasant surprise to me is going on in academia in this country, into Commonwealth and Empire, go down to the street level in this country, so that this particular institution is habilitated in a more balanced form? That answer hasn't yet come to me. Very pleased to see what Jeremy Paxman is doing on the TV. To me, that is one of the first initiatives of the sort that are being taken. But that's my statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to?
I just in relation to that very last comment. I mean, it's very redolent of. I always think it's a tremendously interesting piece that the historian of modern Ireland, Roy Foster, wrote about Irish history. He was really writing about the period in the 70s and 80s, and he talked about this huge disjunction between professional history and public history. It was in some ways quite a disconcerting or depressing piece to read, because the carryover from one to the other was negligible, really. And I think it is a very interesting question that you ask, because we take it as really for granted now that some of the ideas about bringing Britain and Empire back together in a university context are fairly widespread, widely circulating, much easier to teach now than it would have been 15 years ago, and even when the literature is more limited. But whether that's had much of an impression at all on the way that history is taught in schools, I think is another question entirely.
Just Andrew, just point out about that. I mean, I think it's very interesting because we were having a discussion earlier with.
Can you speak up?
We were having a discussion earlier about the problem of what is taught in schools and how they still don't teach really any history about India, about Britain's relationship with the empire. But also, I was thinking of, in terms of reaching the public, the sad case of the Museum of Empire and Commonwealth in Bristol, which was sort of a wonderful initiative in some ways to try and bring together the academic and the popular history, in museum form, and it's been closed. So I think that's quite depressing, really, that so little has happened in terms of reaching, the down into schools and into the popular area.
My personal view is that you have to work with the syllabus that's there, and what's very firmly entrenched in the school syllabus is the history of the two world wars. And when I was in Leeds, we used to go out into local schools and talk about the history of those two world wars as global wars. And picking up actually on some of the points that Philip's been raising, there are good oral history resources about the contribution of Caribbean and Asian soldiers to those two conflicts that one can teach with very effectively in schools. But when you go and do that, you haven't really got any idea as to what sort of impression you're making on the big picture. But I think one of the things is to, rather than try and completely cut across the grain of the existing syllabus, is to try and work with it and turn it.
I think it's being
Can I just
taught
make one
possibly-
comment?
If I could just say, I think it is being taught in schools, but not as part of the GCSE or the A-level syllabus. It's being taught as a unit at an earlier level. And so it would be nice to see it incorporated more within the...
Could I interject here? As an A-level history teacher, I actually teach British Empire history. I teach India 1900 to 1947 for Unit 2, and for Unit 1 I teach the Scramble for Africa 1875 to 1914 and Decolonization in Africa.
Which syllabus is that?
From the example is edX.
I've given talks to schools on exactly these papers. So it is being taught at A-level.
Well, that's
It's a popular option as well.
good to hear.
That's fairly recent, isn't it?
I think if we just have one last question from somebody we haven't heard from, so there's a question at the back there.
I was really going to make a comment and say that it's not only syllabus in schools, but we also need to get the general public interested. In the last 20 years, we've seen quite a number of programs on television. We had the Starkeys and the Shammers, and these have helped to popularize history. Now, for a long time, academia didn't want to get out into the general public, and when you write books like the one you've just written, wonderful, but is the general public going to read that? You know, this is the problem.
Not 35 pounds.
Understand. So we need historians to write at a level also which the public can understand. There are two types of books, one for academia, one for the students of university, and another one for the general public. I think that's lacking.
So I think we will draw things to a close. I can see the makings of another conference here on empire in public history. Can I just say that the book is available outside for the reduced price of £28. So there's a 20% discount if you buy it this evening, and it really is worthwhile doing so. So could I thank Andrew, Richard and Philip very much for coming along and commenting on this book. Thank you.
Thank you.